All right, let's jump right in.
Sounds good to me.
Today we're diving into the evolution of government.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating and
Oh, it is.
yeah, a controversial topic for sure.
Absolutely.
We're looking at some excerpts from Hans Hermann Hoppe, from Aristocracy to Monarchy to Democracy.
That's right. A real classic in the libertarian world.
And its subtitle is A Tale of Moral and Economic Folly and Decay.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches.
No, he does not pull any punches. This is not your typical history lesson.
Not at all. Hoppe really throws out the traditional narrative of progress that we're all used to hearing.
Right.
He actually argues that the move towards democracy might be a step backwards.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. So how does Hoppe even begin to unravel this complex story?
Well, he starts by asking a very fundamental question.
Okay.
How did we end up with a system where the state holds a monopoly on deciding who's right and wrong?
Like, who gets to be the judge?
Exactly.
That's a great question.
I mean, think about it. Would you willingly give up your right to defend yourself or seek justice outside of the government's control?
Probably not. I mean, it kind of seems counterintuitive when you put it that way.
Yeah, it does.
So is he suggesting that we'd all be better off fending for ourselves in some kind of lawless wasteland?
Not quite.
Okay.
He introduces this idea of a natural order as a starting point.
Okay.
Imagine a world without a single overarching government.
Okay, so no, like, big federal government.
Nope. Instead, communities rely on shared traditions, respected figures, and private agreements to settle disputes.
Huh.
It's like a network of small towns where everyone knows the rules and seeks justice from trusted local figures.
Okay, so picture like a wise elder.
Yeah.
Or respected council.
Exactly.
Settling disagreements based on pre-existing laws and customs.
Right.
So it's all about voluntary consent and decentralized power.
Exactly. Now, Hoppe acknowledges that this natural order is a theoretical ideal.
Sure. Yeah, no system's perfect.
Right. He uses early European feudalism as a rough historical example. Okay.
But even that system, wasn't perfect.
All right. Of course, nothing's ever going to be completely flawless.
Of course not.
But I can see how this idea of a natural order sets the stage for understanding Hoppe's critique of how government evolves.
Definitely.
So where do we go from this peaceful world of small, self-governing communities?
Well, that's where things start to go wrong, according to Hoppe.
Uh-oh.
We see the emergence of monarchy,
Okay.
and with it, the rise of the state as we know it.
I'm guessing it's not just about having a king or queen.
No, not at all.
What's the key difference here?
It's the shift from a king who is bound by the law to an absolute monarch who places himself above the law.
Above the law.
Yes. Think of it as a kind of power grab where the king goes from being a respected judge to the ultimate authority on everything.
Ah, so it's the establishment of a monopoly on justice.
Yes.
The king's calling all the shots.
Right.
And I can see how that might lead to some problems. Exactly. And Hoppe argues that this shift allows kings to externalize the costs of their actions, especially when it comes to war. So imagine this: if you break your neighbor's window playing baseball,
Okay.
you have to pay for it.
Right. Makes sense.
But if the government breaks your window building a new highway, they use taxpayer money to cover the cost.
So they're externalizing the costs onto others.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
instead of bearing the full burden of waging war, the king can now force his subjects to foot the bill through taxes.
And that creates a pretty dangerous incentive to go around picking fights.
Precisely. Hoppe argues that this leads to an increase in imperialism and costly wars that benefit the king but harm the people.
It's starting to sound a bit familiar, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, how often do we see governments today engaging in actions that seem to benefit a select few while the costs are spread across the entire population?
All the time. That's a great point.
Yeah, it really resonates with current events.
It does.
But hold on, if the king has all this power, how does democracy even emerge?
That's the irony.
Okay.
The very tools the king used to consolidate his power,
Okay.
appealing to the common man and enlisting intellectuals to support his claims,
Uh-huh.
end up being used against him.
So it's like the king creates the conditions for his own downfall
Exactly.
by playing this game of divide and conquer.
Right, when the king's promises of a better life under his rule fall flat, the intellectuals who helped him gain power turn on him, and they use the same egalitarian rhetoric against the monarchy.
Clever.
So democracy emerges as a continuation of this power struggle, just with a new target.
Right.
But Hoppe doesn't see democracy as some kind of victory for the people.
Really?
In fact, he argues that it doesn't eliminate privilege.
Oh.
It just expands it.
Now, wait a minute. How can that be? Isn't democracy supposed to be about equality and giving everyone a voice?
Well, Hop would say, think of democracy as a game of musical chairs,
Okay.
where the music never stops,
Uh-huh.
and the chairs are government positions offering power and benefits.
Okay, I'm starting to see his point. So instead of having a small group of nobles benefiting from the king's power, we now have a much larger group of elected officials and bureaucrats who can leverage the power of the state to their advantage.
Exactly.
Okay.
They can tax, regulate, and redistribute wealth in ways that benefit themselves and their allies,
Right.
often at the expense of the very people they claim to represent.
That's a pretty bleak view of democracy.
It is, and it goes against the common narrative we often hear about democracy being the pinnacle of political progress.
Right.
But Hop goes even further. He contrasts the mindset of a king with that of democratically elected officials.
Okay, I'm listening. How does he compare those two types of leaders?
He argues that a king thinking about his legacy and the future of his dynasty
Okay.
might be more inclined to make decisions that preserve the value of his kingdom.
So the king has more skin in the game.
Yes, he's like a property owner who wants to maintain and improve his estate for future generations.
Right, so he has a long-term perspective because he sees the kingdom as his own.
Right, but democratically elected officials, knowing their time and power is limited, are more like temporary caretakers.
But like they're renting the kingdom for a few years.
Exactly.
And they have less incentive to think about the long-term consequences of their actions.
Exactly. And Hop argues that this difference in perspective leads to different outcomes with democracy, often resulting in a more short-sighted and ultimately less prosperous society.
This concept of caretaker ownership versus a king's ownership mentality is fascinating.
It is.
It makes you wonder if our current political debates about short-termism versus long-term thinking are rooted in the very structure of our democratic systems.
Yeah, that's a great observation. It seems like Hop is suggesting that these problems are baked into the cake of democracy itself.
This is giving me a lot to think about, but we're just scratching the surface here, right?
Right.
I know Hop goes on to explore the role of plutocrats and the impact of democracy on war.
We have a lot more to uncover.
I'm eager to hear what he has to say about those topics. But for now, it seems like he's painting a pretty grim picture of how government has evolved, from the theoretical ideal of a natural order to the potential pitfalls of both monarchy and democracy.
Yeah, and trust me, there are even more thought-provoking insights to come as we delve further into his analysis.
Welcome back. Before we went to that last segment,
Yeah.
I was starting to get a little concerned. It sounded like Hop was saying that any form of government
Right.
is inherently flawed and destined to fail.
Yeah, he can be pretty pessimistic.
So is there any hope in his worldview?
Well,
Or are we all just doomed to live under oppressive regimes forever?
Hockey definitely isn't known for his sunny optimism.
No.
But he does offer some intriguing alternatives, and one of the most thought-provoking is his idea of decentralization
Okay.
as a way to curb the excesses of the state.
Decentralization, remind me, what exactly does he mean by that?
Essentially, he's advocating for a shift away from these massive centralized states we see today,
Okay.
towards smaller, more localized political units.
Okay.
Think independent city-states regions with significant autonomy,
Okay.
or even a system where power is more evenly distributed among various levels of government.
So instead of having one giant federal government calling all the shots,
Right.
you'd have a bunch of smaller, more self-governing entities.
Exactly. It's kind of like a network of interconnected yet independent communities.
It sounds like a pretty radical departure from the way most countries are structured today.
It is, but Hop believes this type of system would create a more competitive environment for governance.
Okay. How so?
Imagine a world where if you're unhappy with the policies or taxes in your city or region, you could simply move to a neighboring one with a system you find more favorable.
So governments would have to actually compete for citizens,
Exactly.
kind of like businesses competing for customers.
Precisely.
That's fascinating, but wouldn't it lead to chaos and inconsistency?
That's a common concern.
I mean, wouldn't it be confusing to have all these different laws and systems in place?
Sure, but Hop argues that a diversity of systems would actually foster innovation and experimentation.
Okay.
It's like having a bunch of different labs trying out different approaches to governance.
Okay.
The ones that prove successful could serve as models for others,
Right.
while those that fail would face pressure to adapt or risk losing citizens to more attractive jurisdictions.
I'm starting to see the appeal. It's like a constant process of trial and error,
Right.
with governments forced to adapt and improve or risk being left behind.
Mm-hmm.
But is there any real-world evidence to suggest this could actually work?
There are some intriguing historical and contemporary examples.
Like what?
Well, Hop points to places like Liechtenstein, Monaco, and Singapore as examples of smaller states that have achieved high levels of freedom and prosperity.
Those are interesting examples, but they're all pretty unique cases, aren't they?
Of course.
I mean, Liechtenstein is a tiny principality.
Right.
Monaco is a glitzy gambling hub. And Singapore is a very specific kind of city-state. Could this model of decentralization really be scaled up to larger and more diverse societies?
That's the big question. Hop would argue that technology and globalization are actually creating conditions that make decentralization more feasible than ever before.
How so?
Think about the internet.
Okay.
It's allowed information to flow freely across borders, weakening the ability of governments to control the narrative or suppress dissenting voices.
That's a great point. It's much harder for governments to censor information or control the media in the age of the internet.
Right.
People have access to a wider range of perspectives and can connect with like-minded individuals across the globe.
Yeah.
I can see how that could empower movements for greater autonomy and local control.
Exactly. And globalization has created these interconnected economies where businesses and individuals can operate across national boundaries, reducing their dependence on any one particular state.
So while the world is becoming increasingly integrated in some way, it's also creating opportunities for new forms of governance, to emerge ones that are more decentralized and more responsive to the needs of individuals.
Right.
So instead of this top-down model of governance, where a central authority dictates the rules for everyone, we'd have a more bottom-up approach, where power is dispersed and people have more choices about how they're governed.
Yeah.
It's an interesting vision.
It is.
But it also raises a lot of practical questions. For example, how would we ensure that essential services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure are provided in a decentralized world?
Good question.
Would we just have to rely on private companies and charities to fill the void?
Well, Hop is a big believer in the power of private institutions and voluntary cooperation.
Yeah, okay.
He argues that all of these services could be provided more efficiently and effectively through free markets and community-based organizations.
I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced. I mean, aren't some things just better handled by government? Like take healthcare, for instance. It's such a complex and expensive system. How would a purely private model ensure that everyone has access to quality care regardless of their income or location?
Hop would counter that by saying that government-run healthcare systems often suffer from long wait times, bureaucratic inefficiency, and limited choices.
Okay.
He'd argue that a free market in healthcare would spark innovation, lower costs, and improve quality by giving individuals more control over their healthcare decisions.
That's a compelling argument, but it's hard to shake this feeling that some things just shouldn't be left to the whims of the market.
Right.
What about education?
Okay.
Surely we don't want to create a system where only the wealthy can afford a decent education.
Right.
Wouldn't a decentralized model exacerbate existing inequalities?
Well, Hop would say that education could be provided through a diverse mix of private schools, homeschooling, online platforms, and apprenticeships.
Okay.
He believes that competition and innovation in the education sector would actually lead to more affordable and accessible options for everyone, not just the wealthy.
Okay, I'm willing to keep an open mind, but what about infrastructure?
Sure.
Things like roads, bridges, and utilities seem like they require a centralized authority to plan and manage effectively. How could a decentralized society handle these large-scale projects?
Hop would point to historical examples of privately built canals, railroads, and even early telecommunications networks,
Okay.
as evidence that the private sector is capable of handling complex infrastructure projects.
Okay.
He'd argue that a system of private property rights and voluntary contracts would provide the necessary incentives for companies and communities to cooperate and invest in shared infrastructure.
Okay. I'm starting to see how a decentralized society might function on a practical level,
Yeah.
but it still feels like a pretty radical idea, almost like a complete overhaul of the way we think about governance. Is this really a feasible goal, or is it just a utopian fantasy?
Hop acknowledges that the transition to a truly decentralized society would be a long and complex process.
Of course.
He doesn't believe it would happen overnight or through some grand revolution. Instead, he sees it as a gradual evolution driven by technological advancements, changing social norms, and the growing recognition that the old models of governance are failing to meet the needs of the 21st century.
So it's more about planting seeds, nurturing new ideas, and gradually shifting the balance of power away from centralized authorities and towards individuals and communities.
Exactly. Hoppe would argue that the first step is to challenge the prevailing assumptions about the role of government in our lives.
Okay.
Once people start to question the idea that the state has a monopoly on solving problems, they can begin to explore alternative solutions, and that's where things get really exciting.
We've been on quite a journey with Hans Hermann Hoppe,
We have.
exploring his ideas about how government has evolved and where it might be headed.
Yeah, from that theoretical natural order
Yeah.
to the downsides of monarchy and democracy, and now we're venturing into the territory of decentralization and private governance.
It's been a mind-bending experience, to say the least. I have to admit, I'm still grappling with some of these concepts.
Well, it's not easy to wrap your head around such a radically different way of thinking about society.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the elephant in the room. How do we actually get from the world we live in today to this decentralized future? Hoppe envisions, it seems like, such a massive leap, almost impossible to imagine.
Yeah, well, Hoppe doesn't provide a step-by-step instruction manual or a detailed roadmap.
So it's not like he's saying, here are the 10 easy steps to dismantle the state and build a private law society.
Not quite. He's more focused on laying out the philosophical groundwork,
Okay.
exposing the flaws of existing systems, and highlighting the potential benefits of alternative models.
So he's planting seeds of doubt, encouraging people to question assumptions,
Yeah,
and hoping those seeds will eventually blossom into a movement for change.
that's a great way to put it. He believes that real change has to come from the bottom up, from individuals and communities taking more responsibility for their own lives and destinies.
So it's not about waiting for some benevolent dictator or a global revolution to magically fix everything.
Right. It's about empowering people to create the change they want to see in the world, starting at the local level.
That's a powerful message, but it also feels daunting.
Yeah.
I mean, where do we even begin? How do we translate these abstract ideas into concrete actions?
Well, Hoppe would say education is key.
Knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. The more people understand the potential downsides of centralized power and the benefits of decentralization, the more likely they are to demand change and support initiatives that move us in that direction.
So it's about having conversations, sharing ideas, and raising awareness about alternative models of governance.
Precisely. It's about creating a space for critical thinking and challenging the status quo.
It's not just about talking, right? It's also about experimenting with new approaches at the local level and demonstrating the viability of private governance and voluntary interaction.
Absolutely. Think about community-based dispute resolution programs, private security initiatives, or even alternative education models.
It's like building a parallel system, a network of private institutions and voluntary associations that can gradually take over some of the functions currently performed by the state.
That's a great way to think about it. It's about creating a more resilient and adaptable society where people have more choices and more control over their own lives.
I have to admit, this all sounds very idealistic, and I can already hear the skeptics chiming in with a long list of potential problems and challenges.
Of course, there are legitimate concerns that need to be addressed. For example, how do you ensure that private institutions uphold justice and protect individual rights?
Right.
How do you prevent monopolies and ensure fair competition in the provision of essential services? These are all important questions that need to be thoroughly explored.
So it's not about pretending that a private law society would be some kind of utopia where everything works perfectly.
No, it's about acknowledging the complexities and working to develop practical solutions that are grounded in sound principles.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. And it requires open minds, a willingness to experiment, and the humility to learn from our mistakes.
This deep dive into Hoppe's ideas has been a truly eye-opening experience.
It's really challenged my assumptions about the role of government.
Me too.
And it's given me a new perspective on the possibilities for social change.
Even if we don't fully embrace Hoppe's vision for a private law society, his analysis offers valuable insights into the dynamics of power,
For sure.
the importance of individual liberty, and the potential for creating a more decentralized and adaptable future.
Yeah, he reminds us that we're not stuck with the systems we have today. We have the power to imagine and create a different world, one that is more prosperous and more aligned with our values.
It's a powerful message, and one that gives me hope for the future.
Me too.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with this thought.
Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep imagining a world where individual liberty flourishes and the power of the state is kept in check.
Until next time, fellow deep divers, keep those minds engaged.